always so good to see you. I'm so glad you're here because, you know, it's our community, our neighborhood, and our neighbors. She is a postdoctoral fellow, was in science, in human culture and lecturer at Northwestern. She's been a research scholar. She's been at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, PhD student at Princeton, graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and now she is Vice President for Research and Scholarship at Linda Hall Library. And the most important thing about her is that she is the author of a most interesting book called The Dancing Bees, and her name is Dr. Tanya Munz. Tanya, I'm so glad you could come.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I told her, I said, you know, sometimes these scholarly books on science subjects are not spellbinding. This one is. I couldn't put it down, really I couldn't. And it is a most interesting book. It's a combination when you say about the biography of Karl von Frisch, who was the early researcher in the life of bees and his research. So it is fascinating. I would absolutely I got this at Barnes & Noble, and I would absolutely suggest it to you for interesting reading, The Dancing Bees. And they do indeed dance. Mm-hmm. And we're going to discuss that. And The Dancing Bees will be welcomed by anyone seeking a better understanding, not only of this chapter of the history of science, but also the peculiar waggles of our garden visitors. And so let's see, you know, it's also interesting. I want to show you this before we start because you're going to say, how did Dr. von Frisch tell one bee from the other? And the truth is that he marked the bees. And you can see them. They had numbers according to the markings on them. And so he could tell immediately if he had seen the bee before, which bee it was, because they had numbers and letters, and he had a very intricate system, and that's a lot of bees to keep track of. So, and we want to see then what Dr. Munz is going to say about the zoologist, Dr. Karl von Frisch, who, by the way, won the Nobel Prize. Mm-hmm. Why did it take so long for him to get the prize?
You know, that's an interesting question. He won the Nobel Prize in 1973.
He was 87 by that time.
And it was a time when, in a way, von Frisch did a very kind of old-fashioned science, right? He observed animals, he would use microscopes, but lots of kind of conditioning experiments. And this is the time of molecular biology. Yeah. So in 1973... He
was a generation or two behind.
It's really an interesting choice, right, for 1973.
Well, he did the way he knew how to do it.
He did. He also shared the prize, we need to say. He shared it with Nico Tinbergen, who was from the Netherlands, and Konrad Lorenz, who was also from Austria. Karl von Frisch was from Austria, was a Viennese. And it was a recognition for animal behavior studies. You know, it really was considered a sign that animal behavior studies had come into their own. We don't know exactly what the deliberations were because the records are actually still sealed for the Nobel Prize. So exactly how that decision came to pass, we're unsure of. What we do know is that it really gave this science international attention, even more so than it had already
Gave him what he really deserved. He'd had a lot of accolades, though, I must say.
Yes, absolutely.
But he deserved that prize. Yeah. Are the records ever unsealed?
They are. I think it's 50 years. So, well, not too long.
You just have to hang on.
Yes.
Why did you choose this topic? I mean, this book grew out of your doctoral dissertation.
Yes.
Well, why this topic?
So I had done a master's thesis on Darwin's theory of sexual selection.
Well, von Frisch was a big Darwinist.
He was a Darwinist. And Darwin's theory, what was interesting to me about the theory is that it really required animals to make very discerning, fine-grained aesthetic decisions. And it was female animals that had to make those decisions. So I became very interested in the animal-human boundary and how scientists understand that boundary. So as I was looking for a topic for my dissertation, I read widely in the history of animal behavior studies. And then what really pulled me in was the beauty of Karl von Frisch's work. I felt his experiments were incredibly elegant, very
I was going to
smart.
say, in the book you refer to them several times as elegant.
Yes. So the dissertation was a very different project. I wrote actually about Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch, but then I became very just intrigued by Karl von Frisch's science, but also his life story, which I try to weave into the book as being really integral to the kind of work that he ends up doing.
Well, when you discuss the human world and the animal world, there are likenesses. But I'm wondering if we're discussing a matter of intelligence or a matter of instinct when we talk about the bees and the training.
So I think, you know, that is kind of a perennial question. And that very much depends on whom you ask.
I'm asking you.
I'm not a scientist. So I'll tell you what Karl von Frisch says.
Okay.
So Karl von Frisch was very coy about extrapolating from animals to humans. I mean, he sometimes wrote about, you know, things that seem similar to human psychology, like abilities to keep time internally. Certainly communication is the thing, you know, human language is the thing that we consider to separate us from animals. So this was very...
well, that and an opposable thumb.
Yes, that, which the bees do not have. But this was, a lot of people paid attention to this work because it seemed to uncover symbolic communication in a lowly insect. So I think, you know, animals were always seen as managing a very complex social polity, but then this communication piece really captured people's imaginations in all disciplines and really internationally.
Well, and so it should, because, well, I was going to say he was the first one, but Aristotle in the 4th century noticed the bee dances. I mean, that to me that just kind of blew me away.
He was a good
Then in the
observer.
4th century.
Yeah.
Let's talk about inside the hive. We're going to talk about bees. So inside the hive, are we talking about a democracy? We're talking about a commune? We're talking about a monarchy? What are we talking about?
So I think that's what's so interesting about how people study animals and how scientists have studied animals, right? At different periods in time, people have brought different types of questions to animals, and they've also observed different things. So to your question, is it a democracy? Is it a commune? Is it a queendom? Is it a kingdom? It really depends on who you ask over time, right? So that's the interesting thing. All those things were seen in the hive. And even today, when we're not supposed to make those kinds of facile extrapolations between humans and animals, people still look to the hive and they still see their own concerns and their own interests reflected back at them.
Well, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that you can put whatever label you wish on it and see something there.
I think what you are interested in and what you bring to the world tends to influence what you see. You know, a scientist can't just make things up about the hive, but certainly certain commitments may influence someone to see something one way or the other.
Well, and they do communicate. And I would quote you here.
Okay.
And you said, well, this is Dr. von Frisch. He decided to pursue further the question of how bees communicate and made what he later called the most faithful observation of his life, the bees' mysterious dances. Now that is just fascinating to me. We're going to look at their dances in just a minute, but that was the faithful observation. Was that what really interested him in pursuing this? Yeah.
So like you said, Aristotle had already observed that the bees seem to do these kind of vibrating movements in the hive. And then the other piece is that beekeepers had for a long time commented on that it seems that bees somehow must communicate or alert each other to food sources and these kinds of things. So the observations have been made of the dances, and there was an assumption that bees may communicate. Von Frisch is really the person who put those two pieces together, who linked the bee dances to animal communication or to bee communication.
Okay. As we set the stage
Yes.
for all of this stuff, I want to talk about bees' jobs in the hive. That to me is fascinating. Talk about a little bit, different bees do different things.
So that had been, again, as people looked to the hive for instruction for how their society might function, there was a lot of commentary about, isn't the hive clever? Isn't it smart how some tend to the young, some seem to be guards, others go out and collect nectar? Isn't it clever how
Some take care of the queen.
Yes, exactly. Isn't that smart, though, how the society takes care of its very tasks? And we're talking about just insects, right? And they manage this complex society. Because von Frisch developed that numbering system that we saw earlier, von Frisch was able to track hundreds of bees longitudinally. And together with a graduate student, they observed what bees do which tasks in the hive. Because, right, they all look the same. All the worker bees
It's a little bit hard to tell
look
them apart.
very much the same. So, but once you can distinguish between different bees, you can keep track of them and you can see what they do. And the finding was that the bees, in fact, go through different stages of their development and take on different tasks. So it's not that one bee is born an attendant to the queen and is always an attendant to the queen. There are, in fact, different stages that they go through. And at the very end of their lives, they take on the most dangerous job, which is going out and foraging for food.
Because they are expendable at that point, maybe.
I think so, yeah.
What happens, now there are a lot of drones in the hive. What happens to them? And they're all females?
They're male.
They're males.
They're the males. So the drones, when we talk about the kind of gender politics and labor politics that people have seen in the hive and that they've read into the hive, the drones have been just this vexing problem, right? They're the males. Their brains seem to be small. They seem to be sluggish. They don't do a lot of work.
We're going to hear about this, I know.
You're going to get good mail
Yes.
about this. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And there was always sort of a disdain for the drones because, you know, who likes to have just these lazy creatures around?
And it's has been attached to people who are lazy, and you know it's become a noun.
Right. Well, and now if we think about warfare and drone warfare, it's actually taken on an even different kind of meaning. Von Frisch actually, you know, he wrote about the drones, and he created he made a film about the honeybees and talked about the drones. The drones, in fact, get slaughtered every year after they're done fertilizing the queen. But
other insects do that too. The tarantulas, if they don't get out of the way in time, they do as well. The female tries to kill them, and so that isn't unique to bees.
Yep. Yep. But von Frisch really focused on the female worker bees because he was interested in the dance. Those were the animals that went out and then communicated with their hive mates about the distance and direction of the food sources that they had visited.
And we're going to talk about that in a minute too. How do they make decisions?
Well, so there's again many different theories. If you think that bees are intelligent, you think that they make decisions depending on the situation. If you think that they're driven by instincts, then you think there's sort of an inborn program that gets triggered at various stages. You know, scientists had different theories about how the bees make decisions. I mean, when we talk now, we talk about the superorganism, where we talk about how no individual animal is smart enough to oversee what needs to happen in the hive. But collectively, the hive is able to prepare for winter, find a new home, make all these kinds of decisions.
Grow a new queen?
Yes, exactly. So,
and that to me is a large decision because all of a sudden the royal jelly is fed to a regular bee, and therefore a new queen develops who then flies away and starts a new hive. Now that is a big decision to make.
And where to bring the new hive to, right, as well, where to nest. And there's been really beautiful research that's been done that builds on the work that Carl von Frisch did. So it's still cited and it's still used.
Well, now we can show some training. The bees have color vision. And we can show, von Frisch had a diagram. They like blue, a lot of blue flowers. And so how did he use that diagram, the blue, to attract the bees, and what made him think that? I mean, that's, you know, a pretty basic diagram.
Yes. So this image that you see now is really a classic image for the kind of work that Carl von Frisch did. It was early in his career when he started working on this, and there was a dispute. He got into a bit of a tiff with a more senior scientist who said bees cannot see colors. Bees are like colorblind humans. They can't tell different colors. And what von Frisch did, he was very skeptical of this. We had talked briefly about the fact that he was a committed Darwinist. He felt that there was no reason for flowers to have so many different colors if they hadn't co-evolved with bees' abilities to see those colors. So what he would do is he set out a bunch of different black and white squares and one blue square. And then he put the little, you saw the little glass dishes on each of the squares. He put a little bit of
Sweet
sugar
water.
water into the one on blue. And then he would shuffle them around but consistently feed the bees on the blue color. Then he would clear out all the sugar water and just put the glass dishes out empty, and he would observe where the bees landed. And that's what you saw. Those specks that you saw on that blue square were in fact bees congregating on that blue square, presumably without any sugar water. And the argument was that if they were not able to see blue, then how would they be able to find their way to that square? The fact that he is able to condition them to that color must mean that they can tell
They
that
see
they can
something
discern that color.
we see as
right.
blue. Yeah.
And you notice there were different shades of darker and lighter,
Yes.
so that was about the argument that, well, maybe they just recognize it according to their relative lightness or darkness.
Well, and the few red flowers may be wind pollinators rather than
Yes.
bee pollinators. Now, this is to me the most wonderful thing, the waggle. And when they find something good, something nectar, flowers, plants, whatever they're looking for, they come back to the scout bees come back to the hive and they waggle. And we can show you how they waggle and in what direction they're going so that some way the other bees interpret. Now the waggle on the left says what?
So Carl von Frisch distinguished two different dances. He called the one on the left the round dance and the one on the right the tail waggle dance.
And they do waggle their
They
tail.
do. So on the straight portion, you see there's kind of in that figure 8, there's kind of a straight line. Along that line, as the bee runs that figure, it will waggle with its abdomen. Now, today, bee researchers actually don't make that distinction. They call everything the waggle dance. But von Frisch said there's two different kinds, and the waggle dance is what happens when bees forage further than 100 meters from the hive. And that's the dance that he was very interested in because that's what contained the sophisticated information about distance and direction.
Well, that's the communication that he was interested in. And do those, when we show direction, they can point so the other bees know which direction to go. And he had a diagram for that too because he had watched very diligently, and so we can show the directions.
So the part that makes the waggle dance so compelling,
Like you said, is that the bee, when she's back in the hive, will
make that straight run portion, the angle of that straight run portion with respect to the vertical of the hive is the same angle that the bee flew on her way out to that food with respect to the sun.
I found that so fascinating. I can't tell you. And you know, I knew that they did these things, but your book is so readable and so you make it so interesting that I was just absolutely fascinated because the position of the sun plays a big part in how they make that communication. So, you know, I'm thinking that rather than intelligence, it may be instinct. I don't know.
You know, I mean,
I think one of the things I
think those questions are perennially interesting, right?
they are.
Humans are fascinated by animals, and this is the kind of question that persists, and the way we answer it changes over time and changes with the acceptable standards of science.
It is.
I think one thing that was very interesting is that Martin Lindauer, who was a student of Carl von Frisch's, figured out that they don't just use this communicating system to indicate distance and direction of foods, but that they also use it to communicate about potential nesting sites to hive mates. So it's not just about the food, it's as though those words to the left, to the right, far away, close by, are in fact usable for other kinds of problems that the hive needs to solve. And that's fascinating, and that was a boon to Karl von Frisch and his work.
Well, and in a hive, there are an awful lot of bees.
Yes.
So communicating, somehow they pass that communication around too, because one bee can't communicate to all the bees in the hive at the same time.
Yep.
I would think not.
Yep.
Anyway. I want you to see his lab notes because I looked at, I mean, can you make head nor tail of that? I can't. But that's how he kept his lab notes. And if you'll notice, Dr. Munz was talking about the fact that he did everything the old-fashioned way, and he kept his lab notes. You know, somebody will see this, Tanya, and they'll say, well, why didn't he? I mean, we would do it on a computer. And he, look at how he did
But
that.
you know what's amazing about that is that in fact you are able to read it. So in the very left hand, we don't have to go into too much detail, but on the very left hand it says number 61. That's bee,
Now that's the bee number.
61. It gives you the time of day, and then I'm not sure what the next, I just can't read it from here, but then that arrow tells you the direction
Of the waggle dance, which is what he was sorting out as he was doing this research, right? That's when he cracked the code on them indicating the direction.
So the thing is, it is really old school.
It is.
But even now, it is very readable and understandable, and you can kind of see how the longevity of this kind of research.
It's still.
And it's a privilege to see it, right? It's a privilege for us to get
I
to.
felt so. I
Yeah,
did.
me
I
too.
really did.
Absolutely.
Scent. They you know, the flowers smell nice, and so the bees are interested in that as well. And he trained them to different scents as well. But what I thought was really interesting was that some flowers only smell at certain times of the day when the pollinators are most active, and some don't smell at all, and those usually are not bee pollinated. They're wind pollinated, or you know. Or sometimes birds eat the seeds and do whatever, and but they only smell at certain. But he was able to train those bees to scent as well, and they have an internal clock as well. Talk about that just a little bit. I thought that was, I mean, I was just fascinated with the whole thing. You'll have to forgive me because I thought the whole thing was just absolutely fascinating.
Well, and Karl von Frisch also, you know, after the war, he said, even though he was doing this work on honeybee community, he said this is one of the most interesting findings that they've made, that the bees have this internal clock. One of his students, Inge Behling, actually ended up pursuing that. That was not really central to what he ended up, he really was captivated by the bee dance language. But the fact that they have this internal clock, and he wanted to, you know, researchers were curious about, is it something that is just intrinsic to the animal? Is it something that has something to do with the radiation from the earth? Is it about the sun? You know, there were all these possibilities that were being tossed around, and they did this very cool experiment where they flew a hive of bees to New York and did an experiment on whether they would adjust to local time or keep their time, and in fact they kept their time. So high-tech work for that time.
Fascinating. Now, von Frisch had what we might call major difficulties during the war, and I want you to talk a little bit because he was German, and he worked in Germany at the time that Hitler came to power, and he had a grandmother that was Jewish. Now that was a major problem. But I thought that was so interesting how carefully he navigated those danger-infested Nazi waters. Talk about that just a little bit, because I thought that was he was able to continue his research.
Yeah,
So
it
go
is
on.
really, I mean, this is sort of what I was alluding to earlier, how it just got so sucked into his life. I think, you know, the archives in Munich have all of his personal papers, and they document this struggle. He was born in Vienna and worked at the University of Munich, and in January 1941 got a letter that said, we have now determined that you are a quarter Jewish, and we will push you out of your university position, we'll force you into retirement. And there had been rumors, and there had been trouble, and he had been requested to provide more documentation about the Aryan ancestry of that maternal grandmother, but he wasn't able to do it. And then in 1941, the government, in fact, found baptismal records of the maternal grandparents showing that she had converted.
They converted, yes.
So what was difficult, I think, for Karl von Frisch is, you know, it's 1941, that's very late. The borders are closed. There was not going to be an easy way to leave. So he ended up totally revamping his work and focusing on a bee plague, actually. There were bees dying at the time, and he reworked his own work, he reoriented his lab, and he was able to successfully fight for his job, which to me, it was very interesting to see how somebody would navigate that bureaucracy that wasn't transparent and that was frightening and overwhelming.
Well, and he gathered together a lot of people that knew him and supported him, from all, even the beekeepers came to his, but he did make a small slip in there because at one point he wrote about eugenics.
Right.
And he was fearful, I think, and tried to, but he didn't stay on that very long.
You know, I think what's hard about spending so much time with someone is that you always want to be sympathetic, but you also don't want to make excuses for anyone, right? So I think that a lot of people in the early 20th century in Europe and the United States were very enthusiastic about eugenics, and that turned into a very dark chapter, not just in Germany, in the most extreme form, but also in the United States.
Yes.
So as an author and as a historian of science, you want to get to the bottom of it and you want to be as balanced as possible, but that is part of his story. You know, he wrote about eugenics and he ended up making a lot of money on that book.
Yeah.
So nobody comes out 100% clean
No,
out of
they
these
don't. And I thought it was
tough
important to
times.
point that out.
Absolutely.
I think that is important. We're not growing saints here.
No. There were some, but they're hard to find.
No. But you know, one thing he wrote that I thought was interesting, he said, "We also mind the veil beyond which the bee's soul will always remain hidden." And I thought that was kind of interesting. It almost smacked of religion.
Spirituality,
Yes,
right? Yep.
yeah. And so there was another side to him as well.
Yes, and there's a kind of a very poetic way of expressing the limits of science. And I think he was very cognizant of that, even though he was kind of a hard-nosed scientist. He was somebody who didn't speculate about, are the bees clever, are they emotional? He really kept a scientifically appropriate distance as
That
he
was the
felt.
one place he slipped.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's exactly the way he indicated that distance in a very...
And that may be true.
Yeah.
That may be true. He said, he said that when he called the bee humanity's greatest friends among insects, and I think that is true. In the case of in great friendships, we are all in this together, the bee and we, for better or for worse, which I thought was really a good way to say to Dr. Tanya Muntz, thank you so much for coming to visit us and for letting me have the privilege of reading The Dancing Bees. Get a copy. I think you'll enjoy it. And thank you, Tanya.
Thank you
It
very
was
much.
so interesting, and you have made a real contribution, I think. Linda Hall should be very pleased to have you. I'm sure they are.
Thank you very much.
Linda Hall, by the way, is one of the finest science libraries in the world. And if you haven't visited, it's on the campus of UMKC and an independent and freestanding institution. So go visit Linda Hall. It's a science library. Thank you for being with us. It's wonderful to have you. And do come again, because it's our community and these are our neighbors. Take care.